And now I give the floor to Mrs. Slater and her presentation.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here today, especially with this distinguished panel, my good friends who I know who have been fighting for the true human rights for many years now and doing a great job of it. And I am going to ask you to fasten your seatbelts because I'm going to go through a lot of information very quickly, and some of it's going to be troubling, but it's all very important. And I'm going to start with the next slide. Next slide. Building on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations facilitated the creation of 9 core human rights treaties. These are the core treaties that expound upon and establish the UN human rights. Then they created human rights mechanisms to monitor compliance with these treaties. I'm going to talk about 3 of those methods, back one, starting with the treaty body monitoring committees. And I'm going to use the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as the example, also known as the CRC. They established a committee called the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which issued general comment number 15. Somehow, magically, they found in this convention a right that children have a right to sexual and reproductive freedom. Go back, please. Children have a right to, sorry, not quite so fast. That children, go back where I was, one before this. The children have a right to sexual reproductive freedom, confidential counseling without parental consent, sexual education without the permission of a parent. Yet the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that parents have a prior right. So this goes against the Universal Declaration. Then they recommended to Mozambique, because they also make recommendations to individual countries, that they ensure girls access to abortion. But yet, the preamble of this very convention they're monitoring says that children are entitled to protection before as well as after birth. And then they issued general comment number 14 saying a child has a right to preserve their identity, and that includes sexual orientation, which is found nowhere in the treaty. The second mechanism is the Universal Periodic Reviews, where nations are called before their peers, the other UN countries. It's also called the UPR. And every 5 years, they're reviewed on their human rights records. With permission from CFAM, I have this slide produced by Rebecca Oas, who's fantastic in gathering the research. And this was only just the beginning of the UPRs up to 2017. And look at this chart. You've got red represents abortion pressure from countries at the UPR. The blue, the dark blue, represents the SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity pressure. And look how it began escalating. Next slide, also from CFAM. I thought, maybe it's not here. Next slide. Okay, it's not here. But the next slide was also Rebecca's research that showed that most of those over 1,000 recommendations that pressured on sexual orientation and gender identity came from only 4 countries. There was over 1,000 recommendations, and that's just the very beginning of that. Next. So who is creating and pushing all these rights? One of the big pushers of this is International Planned Parenthood Federation, and they created the Exclaim Book of Sexual Rights, and the World Health Organization and the European Union sends children through their sexuality education manual to this publication to learn about their sexual rights. Next slide. And they will find this. It says that governments are to ensure that young people understand that they are entitled to sexual pleasure, and how to experience different forms of sexual pleasure is important to their health and well-being. No matter what age, they have this right to sexual pleasure. And these rights include the fact that your country must liberalize its abortion laws and legalize same-sex marriage, among other things. I'll skip to the next human rights mechanism, the special rapporteurs and the experts hired by the UN to expound human rights. Here's some of them right here, and I only have time to highlight a few. We'll start with, this is a previous one, but he was the special expert on the right to education, and he called parents a barrier when they block sex education for their children, because he said children have a right to pleasurable sexual experiences, including through comprehensive sexual education to help them to do that. The UN Special Rapporteur, who's the highest expert in the world, supposedly, because of the highest expert in the UN on the right to mental and physical health, she used to have a podcast. She was Dr. T. She was a promoter of abortion and decriminalization of sex work. And she said her goal on her podcast is to elevate sexual pleasure using sex toys, talk about masturbation, and so forth. And she promotes comprehensive sexuality education for children. Now, I'm going to take a turn. We're going to swerve off of what I was just doing, and we're going to talk about an agreement called the Samoa Agreement that was supposed to be signed the 15th of this month, just yesterday, or depending on which time zone you are, the day before, by 105 UN member states, the EU countries and 79 ACP countries. Here are the countries here. And I'm going to tell you that I have a personal interest in there. Some people went, why are you off in Africa? Well, we adopted 3 children from Mozambique, so our family's part African. And currently, my daughter, who married a man from the Congo, is in the Congo with her husband. And I have 4 grandchildren in Africa, so I have a personal stake in what happens in Africa. So these are the orphans that we adopted. They're now older and have children. The last one's in college. And they are victims of the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the messaging on sexual behavior and sexual rights. Their parents died of AIDS. Their older brother died of AIDS. I cared for him during the last stages of his AIDS, and it's atrocious what that disease can do. Next slide. This agreement was previously called the Cotonou Agreement. It was a 20-year binding treaty, and it was about economic and development issues and finances. Keep going. So the new treaty replaces that, and experts who have analyzed it, there's been 3 different studies from the economic perspective said that overall there was no economic benefit the last 20 years, and there's not going to be one moving forward overall from this treaty. Surprise, surprise. Article 79.1 is why we all need to be concerned, because it requires those who are part of this treaty to have joint positions in voting in United Nations international forums and even regional forums. Next slide. So the EU says they're going to have over half of the UN member seats through this treaty if everybody signs on. And for this new treaty, they added a chapter on human rights. Next slide, if you can. And the treaty in Article 7 designates human rights as an essential part of the agreement, which means you can't put reservations or amendments on it. And there's over 100 references to human rights, and there's 350 pages of complicated treaty. And Article 80 requires all of the countries to cooperate with what did we just learn about? Human rights bodies and mechanisms. All those recommendations, comments, okay? The African Regional Protocol, and I want to stop here and talk about Family Watch's focus on children and why we are concerned about this because of children. The African Protocol, that's just for the African countries, calls for them to implement comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights in accordance with the UN's International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, or within that framework. Next slide. Hopefully. Okay. Yeah, here's an example of an excerpt out of that manual. It calls for them to differentiate between their values that they hold and that their parents hold about sexuality, separating children very purposely. We've analyzed probably 100 comprehensive sexuality education programs, many of them published by the UN, and they almost all of them teach children they have a right to sexual pleasure and transgender ideology, confusing about their gender. This is the African training manual that tells children, next slide, that gender identity means knowing whether one is male, female, or somewhere in between. This is the manual for Africa. This is interesting because it has the logo, you can't see it because it's very slow, of the European Commission, which this treaty is with, on it. And not only does it take children through the separation from their children's values, but it teaches children all about it desensitizes them to sex with all these different acts They're supposed to go through a list of about 20 sexual patterns, including pederasty, bestiality, necrophilia, urophilia, sadism, masochism, voyeurism. And then they're supposed to share with the group what they learned. Next slide. The International Islamic Fiqh Academy, which is the Islamic scholars that issue fatwas for all of Islam, just issued a fatwa against this treaty because of its expansion of rights with sexual reproductive health and rights, and in particular, comprehensive sexuality education for children. Next slide. And Namibia, their foreign affairs, just issued this document of why they are not signing this treaty. They said it's a 20-year binding treaty. There's no glossary of terms defining any of the broad, many, many broad terms throughout the treaty. It refers to over 80 other documents that you're supposed to implement. Imagine trying to read all of those documents and this and understand every word of it. It elevates non-binding agreements to legal binding treaty with the EU. And it requires commitment to the full and effective implementation of future documents of ICPD review conferences that may bind parties to future processes and outcomes that cannot be predicted at the present moment. Keep going. This is the ICPD document that's required to become a binding treaty. Right now it's not under the treaty. And what was the practice is every 5 years, all the UN member states would negotiate an outcome document. But for ICPD plus 20, countries got together and decided they're going to divert that process, not have them all negotiate it because they knew they weren't getting ahead in the sexual rights they wanted. So they would do their own reviews and sponsor them. Next slide. So the treaty requires the parties to commit to the full and effective implementation of ICPD, next, and the outcome documents of their review conferences, next, and commit to sexual and reproductive health and rights in that context, in the context of the outcome documents and the review conferences. So here is the EU's review of ICPD plus 20, of human rights review, sponsored by UNFPA, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the government of the Netherlands. There were 300 participants, 127 United Nations member states, the heads of almost all the major UN agencies, NGOs. Planned Parenthood was there in force, and all their partner organizations. Next slide. The ones that create that exclaim, that's how they define sexual reproductive rights that we looked in before. IPIS, they're one of the biggest promoters of abortion globally. Next slide. They created the handheld abortion suction kit that they sell all across the world and that UNFPA has on their list of items that need to be part of the package of sexual reproductive health services. But this helps you see how they're defining sexual reproductive health and rights. You look at this excerpt from this document that's required to be implemented by the treaty because it's an outcome document, and it's a human rights review, so it's an essential part of the treaty, right? It says, bring laws and regulations that criminalize or otherwise impinge on sexual and reproductive rights in accordance with what? Social justice and sustainable development, including those that restrict comprehensive sexuality. Go back to the slide, please. Comprehensive sexuality education, and those that criminalize consensual same-sex relations or sex work, or that deny abortion. Next slide. Reaffirm that sexual and reproductive rights are universal human rights, meaning that they are existing already in the United Nations treaties, the international human rights instruments. They're just redefining them with the committees and all the mechanisms, right? Irrespective of age. And this is where Family Watch comes in. Our interest is the protection of children. And we are fighting comprehensive sexuality education everywhere. And they're working to make this a human right because they teach them sexual things that they are not prepared to handle. They confuse them about their gender identity. If they go down that pathway, they can become infertile for life, lose their sexual functioning if they go through the medical processes. And we stand for the protection of children. Next slide. I am getting towards the end. Strengthen national human rights institutions. That's where a lot of the money is going to go. It doesn't go directly in the pockets of the countries. This is the treaty. They're going to be strengthening that whole system I told you about. Next slide. and regulate, control, investigate, and prosecute actions by non-state actors that violate these human rights that are sexual and reproductive rights. Next. And the EU is going to have to give to support the diverse range of citizens and organizations involved in monitoring, fulfilling obligations of sexual and reproductive health and rights. It's all the lobbyists that they're going to fund through this treaty. Next. And finally, Namibia says they're not signing it. Why? Because it has a supremacy clause that says that no other treaty, no other arrangement, no other agreement with any other country can trump this. This trumps every other agreement that every country has, and there's other sections that shows it trumps their national laws. Next. We invite you to join with us to protect children from this treaty. We invite you to encourage, you know what? 35 countries didn't sign. It was a miracle on the 15th. 35 of those ACP countries, according to an article that was just released. We need to make it more. We need to help those countries that signed to unsign, because this is going to be one of the greatest assaults on children, on human rights, on families, on religious rights, and all the rights that we're promoting here. Thank you.